Good evening, everyone. My name is Martin Jones. I'm happy to be your host this evening and to welcome you to this event ahead of World Refugee Day on Monday, the 20th of June and Refugee Week in the UK. Before I begin, there's a few technical notes I should give you. If you're watching this live, you can ask questions using the question and answer the Q&A button on your screen, and this will be available throughout the event, so questions can be asked at any time. If you happen to have technical issues, you lose Wi-Fi, you get disconnected, no worries. The same link that got you here in the first place, go back to that, click on it again, and you'll end up back with us. Today's event will be recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again in case you happen to lose your connection also. And subtitles are available for the event. To turn these on or off, there should be a CC live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So as I said, I'm really delighted to welcome you here this evening and for you to join us for what I hope will be an interesting conversation. We're proud that the University of York became a University of Sanctuary in September 2020. And in doing so, it joined the City of York, becoming a City of Sanctuary in signaling its desire to become a welcoming and safe place for refugees, for asylum seekers and other people who've been forced to leave their homes. At the end of the event tonight, we're scheduled to be together in conversation for an hour. At the end of the event tonight, we'll be showing a short video of the inspirational story of one of our PhD students from the politics department, Mamoun Kawar. So wait until the end and you'll learn a little bit about his journey to York. He's beautifully narrated his 12-year journey to here. And why he is in York and what York means to him. So please stay at the end to watch this. But back to the conversation. I'm delighted to be chairing tonight and to be here with you with award-winning author Helen Benedict and Syrian writer and refugee Eyad Awwadawnan. And tonight, this evening, we'll be able to have, I think, a rare and important conversation about the lives of refugees. During the conversation with Helen and Eyad, like I said, I invite you to take part by asking your questions throughout using the Q&A button on the screen. And before we begin, let me maybe say a few more words about our speakers who, in their wonderful book, Map of Hope and Sorrows, teamed up to present the stories of 5 refugees from the Middle East and Africa who fled violence and persecution only to become trapped in one of the world's worst refugee camps in Greece. So first about Helen. Helen Benedict is a recipient of the 2021 Penn John Stein Grant for Literary Oral History and the Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism. She's the author of 13 books, including the award-winning Lonely Soldier, The Private War of Women at War Serving in Iraq, and the novel Wolf Season. Her writing inspired both a class action suit against the Pentagon on behalf of people sexually assaulted in the military and the 2012 Oscar-nominated documentary, The Invisible War. She's also a professor of journalism at Columbia University in New York. Eyad Awwadawnan is a formerly a law student from Damascus, Syria. He's a writer, a poet, and currently living as an asylum seeker in Reykjavik, Iceland. During his 4 years in Greece, he worked as a cultural mediator, a translator, and interpreter for various civil society organizations, and he also published a featured article in Slate magazine detailing his escape from Syria. So Helen and Eyad, a very warm welcome to you virtually to York and to our conversation tonight.
Thank you so much.
I suppose the first place to begin is really kind of in the beginning of your relationship. You wrote this book together telling the lives of these refugees with whom you had encounters, with whom you shared parts of your lives in different ways in Greece. Perhaps you could tell us how this book began and how you came together, and for that matter, how it came to fruition even during the difficult times of the pandemic.
Perhaps I'll begin if that's okay with you, Eyad. So I went to Samos in June of 2018 because I was interested in seeing what was happening with refugees there. I read a lot about what was happening on the island of Lesbos. but I knew that there was also a camp on Samos, which some said was even worse, but somehow was being overlooked. And my second day there, I went into a stationery shop, and there was this young man speaking to the shopkeeper in English. And Eyad, you take it from here.
So that day when I was speaking English to the shopkeeper, she knows that I speak English, as you mentioned before. She came towards me with a big smile. She introduced herself to me, and she invited me for coffee. That day I was not free, so I apologized, and we agreed to do it the next day. The next day she was in the camp. She was trying to see the camp manager there, but after waiting like for an hour and a half, 30 degrees, that wasn't summer, as you know, and you know how it's in Greece about summer. Anyway, she couldn't make it. So I saw her and we walked out of the camp because it is not allowed to talk to journalists inside the camp. They don't like this. Anyway, so we went out. I showed her the first 16 days when we slept in the forest. There was no space for us in the camp, inside the camp. And there was a friend with us called Hasan. And I introduced him to Helen, saying that this is a man without hope, with no hope. That was the beginning, like kind of. We start seeing each other regularly. She was working in her novel, upcoming novel, called The Good Deed. So she wanted to talk to an asylum seeker, refugees, and I knew some people that they are willing to share their stories with Helen. And according to the situation, Helen, she saw that she can do something. She must do something about writing.
Yeah, I had to. It was so horrifying in that camp, and the stories were so compelling, and the people were so very kind to me who I met. I began to write some articles, and then later on we got the idea. I went back several times of going around to other camps, and Eyad would join me as an interpreter, and we would interview people in other camps, in some of the more remote camps that are near the Macedonian border, where people were being tucked away out of sight. And then COVID hit, and I couldn't go, and I realized, well, Eyad's in Greece. He can interview people and see people there, and I'll have to rely on WhatsApp and a little tiny camera and do it from afar. And that's how we came to being co-authors. But we worked on this for years, and we talked to many people, and we chose these 5 because they were the most eager to tell their stories, because they represented a range of experiences, and because they had a passion to them that we wanted to capture. But there were other people we would have loved to include and didn't have room for.
And Hasan ends up being kind of one of these 5. The story of the man without hope, in a sense, is the story that you open the book with,
Yes.
and his story figures quite prominently. And
Yes.
and you know, and to be fair to some of those other stories that you feel like you had to leave out, I mean, one of the things about the book that I think people need to know is how although there's these 5 central characters, you weave in and out the lives of the people around them. I mean, it's very much a story of these people, but also the communities that they're living in.
Yes, and their stories go over their whole lives too. It was very important for us not to just focus on that moment of crisis in someone's life when they get forced into being a refugee or an asylum seeker, but to portray their whole lives, to show them as the full human beings we all are. So including, childhoods, families, lives at home, happy memories, and all the way up through. So each person has sort of 3 chapters, if you like, one of their time at home, one of their journey when they had to flee, and one of what happened to them when they reached Greece. And the stories are all in their own words, which was also extremely important to us, to allow the people the dignity and control and autonomy of telling their own stories in their own words.
You describe these stories as very much kind of belonging to the people who told them to you, and that was kind of very much an important part of the process of capturing them. Are there particular stories that you heard that made it into the book, kind of particular passages? Is there a particular passage, I suppose, for each of you that particularly captures the experience of capturing these stories, or that stays with you more than, I mean, the book as a whole is a wonderful creation and I think an important contribution. But is there a passage that you think that you go back to more than others?
Yeah. Eyad, would you like to start?
Yeah. So there is really something Asmahan said, and still with me all the time. So she is saying, you know, Eyad, we came here because the West is merciful and sympathetic to humans, but the time on Lesbos displayed any image of mercy, pity, and kindness I had. There we were just like a homeless cats around us, crowding around any empty tin of sardines. Sorry, just I'm nervous a little bit, so excuse my. Okay, fighting each other just to get fish, oil, or leftovers. You will see people of different nationalities quarreling over one tomato, a massacre for a bottle of milk, meaning that what is happening in Syria is happening in Greece as well. I think what she is saying, like, there is no war in Greece. That's true, there is no war, but what you are facing there kind of makes the people behave as if there is a war. When you are fighting for like a bottle of water, when you are fighting for juice or tomato. So this is kind of like a war.
And that theme also of the humanity of refugees being ignored, and kind of the analogies with animals kind of comes up, I think, in many of the other stories where people talk about being treated like cattle or other creatures. Yeah.
So along those lines, actually, I was really struck by some of the words that Mursal said to me. She is the young Afghan woman, 21 years old, who is also one of the main people in our book. And she said this, she partly wrote it herself, actually. She said, if our country was at peace, we would never leave. No one wishes to live in a tent or a camp. Everyone loves their home. Unfortunately, the Taliban came to our city and started fighting. Right before we left our country, we waited for the new year to come, but our new year opened with war and the sound of bombs, not with balloons. That night we had no dinner, only tears. Refugees are not bad people. Please stop hating us. Just put yourself in our place. How would you feel if you were insulted every day on the bus? Would you be patient? If you look, you will see we are like you. And then she says at the end, being a refugee means you are strong. You passed through a difficult, dangerous journey, and still you are alive. You have hope. You have goals and dreams. As my mom says, when you find yourself in a bad situation, just remember this. After every dark night, a beautiful morning will come. So she was very direct about how distressing it was to meet up with prejudice and hostility from citizens around her. She was also very direct about how much it meant to her and her family when they were met with kindness. She talks about that a lot. And then she is also really strong about what they survived, the strength it gave them, and her insistence on holding on to hope, as you could hear.
Those are wonderful, and I think representative kind of excerpts from the book, which is filled with these moments of wisdom from the people who are telling their stories and reflecting upon, as you say, the greater expanse of their life and their experience. It strikes me that in embarking upon this project, it's a different type of project, maybe Eyad, than you've embarked upon as a poet, or Helen, you embarked upon as a novelist, or certainly even as a journalist. You're very much kind of with, I mean, Eyad in a very literal sense, with these individuals in the place that they're living, and trying to tell their stories. It strikes me that as you know, that poses particular kind of challenges with how we might understand our relationships with these kind of, in a sense, these co-authors. You know, the traditional journalistic ethics, and you talk about this in the book, the traditional journalistic ethics kind of would seem to require a greater distance, whereas kind of a more novelist approach would allow greater freedom. I mean, how did both of you navigate that path in terms of being with and being true to these stories, but also kind of just your relationship with these individuals who are very much in need, as both of these accounts these passages that you've read to us kind of suggest, you know, fighting as was described, kind of like cats over sardines in a tin?
Well, I think our answers will be very different because we're approaching from very different positions. You know, I was coming in as an outsider, of course. And yes, I was there in the camp a lot, and I did see the various homes that they were, you know, had made out of tents or rags or bits of wood. And I was there enough to really get a sense of what life was like from day to day, aside from just asking people. But it's partly because I hadn't been through that myself that I wanted to step out of the way and be more of a listening ear than a director, if you like, you know, and not filter their experiences through my Western white eyes. And it was because of that promise, I think, that, and because I've spent so many months and years doing this, that I won their trust. But it's true, I didn't take the usual distance that I have in other kinds of stories. I decided, you know, if somebody needs help, they're going to get help. If somebody needs a friend, I'll be a friend. Because when you're dealing with people who are living on the edge like that, you just can't be stingy. You have to be a human being first. And I felt that very strongly enough to change some of my rules about how to be a journalist. And I have no regrets about it. Eyad's case was very different. You want to?
So I would say, like, when you are living in a camp, when you have nothing to do, okay, the only thing you are able to do is talking. So you build relationship with someone, you make friends, and sometimes just listen to someone is more than enough to win this trust. Look what happened between me and Asmahan. Asmahan, I have met her like in September 2019. She was alone. She wanted a friend, and she wanted a son and someone to listen to her. So we were spending hours and hours before even thinking about writing this book. I have met Asmahan long time before this book comes. So we were talking, we were digging in memories, we were sharing everything. And sometimes this is the way how you trust someone, the way you build trust. So I would say it is totally different from Helen, but I would say for me, it is just being a refugee in a camp. This is a reason to be a friend with someone who has the same situation as you. Yeah. So the other thing also, I would say, sometimes when someone share with you, like, let's say, memories, bad memories or good memories, that's mean he trusts you or she trusts you. And this is our case. The trust built with being a good friend who can listen to you without judgment, who can just be him or herself with you.
I mean,
yeah. Also, could I just add that there was something true, things evolved. So I did, as Eyad said, I met Hasan through him early on, and we were friends long before we thought about doing the book. But Hasan had said to me right at the beginning, will you promise, I want you to promise to tell my story one day. And I took that promise very, very seriously. He really wanted to tell his story through someone. So that evolved. And then with several of the other people, I actually had been interviewing them over WhatsApp and had never met them in person until last summer, when COVID, loosened up enough for me to get back to Greece. And then, so that it's interesting meeting someone only on the screen and talking to them intensely and intimately for more than a year, and then meeting them in person. And I describe some of that in the book. So these were unusual ways of, all unusual in terms of journalism.
It is interesting that kind of for a category that, the bureaucracy that's developed around refugee protection, that thinks that is so focused upon understanding somebody's story, right? I mean, as you both tell in the book, kind of the telling of the story and the recognition of the story through various bureaucratic processes becomes incredibly important for people in terms of what they get to go on and do and what the options are presented to them. And yet kind of there's this chronic condition of not feeling heard, of not feeling like any of those bureaucratic storytelling exercises fully captures or even partially captures the individual, that there's still a real need for somebody's story to be heard.
Yeah. Well, when you're telling your story to a immigration lawyer or somebody who's deciding whether to give you asylum, more often than not, they're busy trying to catch you out in a lie so they can reject you. That is a very different kind of listening ear than somebody who wants to know your story because they respect you and they respect your story. So yes.
And I mean, and it strikes me also, Eyad, you talk about this a bit in the book as well, that kind of beyond your role in writing this book and capturing these stories for the book, you also played a role in many of your friends' lives and other people living in the camp's lives in terms of helping them navigate processes. I mean, your legal training, your language skills, make you kind of de facto an interpreter, a translator, a counselor. How did you navigate that role? I mean, because that strikes me as kind of equally complex and difficult and different than the kind of listening that you need for a project like this.
I would say when you are able to help someone, everyone, I guess, if he or she is willing to help, he will help or she will help. So in my case, when I was in the camp, when I see the miserable situation, when I see that a woman wants to talk to a doctor and she doesn't have anyone to translate, or a man, I would help. So I guess the thing is, when you are in need, when you are hungry, you know what it feels. Imagine if I don't speak English and I was looking. I remember the first day when I went to the camp, I was trying to talk to the interpreter who was working with IOM. He screamed at me. So I said, I will never use someone like him to translate. I will do it myself. So I think it is really important for me to help me, at least to help the others. And this is the thing, in a camp, when you are surrounded by nothing and you see a lot of people who in need, you try your best to do something. Also, when you know that how is the system works, you try to make sure that they don't fill in this hole, because they just want a small mistake on you to give you rejection.
One of the things that Eyad, you mentioned earlier that kind of comes across in the book is this idea of time. And you spoke about it a moment ago when you talked about how in the camp, there's often very little to do. And so you're waiting. And so you fall into these conversations about these storytelling moments. I was wondering if both of you could say kind of, it strikes me that kind of, even though the kind of the overriding metaphor of the book is kind of as a map, the map of hope and sorrows is the title, it's kind of a chronology as much as anything. Kind of it talks about kind of the time, and in a sense the timelessness, in not in a good way, in a bad way, of the lives of people often trapped in these places, in these camps. Wonder if you could share any reflections that you had about kind of the sense of time and the difficulty of waiting and that you encountered in listening to these stories and in your own stories.
Would you like to say something, Helen, about this?
Okay. One thing that I learned quite early on by talking to people and just by walking around and looking and seeing the look that on people's faces and the way they were sitting, their body language, that one of the worst aspects of these refugee camps in Greece is that they force people into idleness. You can't work, you can't go to school. You're plucked out of your life. You're plucked out of a sense of mattering, out of a sense of belonging, out of all the obligations we have that are part of who you are. And suddenly you're just sent adrift in a place that is telling you every day, one way or the other, you don't matter. You're nothing. And that enforced idleness and that sense of being treated as worthless is so eroding. It really can make people absolutely crazy, and sometimes it does. One of the things that struck me is that how eager everybody was to volunteer to work for any NGO they could. So many people were, even though it doesn't pay, and refugees are the last people who should have to work for no pay. But just to have something to do and to feel useful and to find ways of helping other people, as Eyad was saying. So that is, and it's so unnecessary. Instead, people could be given language lessons, job training. They could be put in the school. They could be helped to integrate into society and be useful. That's what everybody wants, is to be useful and to support themselves and not to be a burden.
I would like to add something more, like something I have experienced when I was in the camp. Like every time when you try to leave the camp out to some places when you have some peace, quiet places, every time you go to the beach, the police will stop you and they will say their sentence, go camp. And the irony that even when we are in the camp, we are like trying to gather ourselves for tea in the square of the camp. They will just come towards us and they will say, go sleep. So we were making jokes between each other that there is a chance that they will come to your nightmare as a nightmare. So looking to the Greek students leaving their schools, this is also something sad for us. Like a lot of us came to the camp who has been in uni before, who has dreams and goals, and suddenly he found himself locked in a camp where he cannot do anything or she cannot do anything. So the lack of, let's say, I would say like losing your hope slowly, but sometimes to keep this hope, you have to do something. Being a volunteer, trying to help someone. This is the thing. Like even with everything is miserable around you, misery around you, but you still able to do something just to keep and to hold your hope.
I think that's an important observation. The book talks not simply about how refugees have to kind of fight, as you say, kind of against these bureaucracies that would deny them the paperwork they need to move on, the recognition as refugees. But I mean, but also orders them around in so many other ways. And I wanted to spend a moment focusing on kind of one of the accounts in the book, and particularly about kind of not just the use of the word refugee to label people, but kind of the use of the word criminal, or in extreme cases, kind of not uncommon cases, kind of human trafficker to kind of label people. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is about how difficult it has become for refugees to travel to Greece, not just because it's a difficult journey and a very dangerous one, a very hazardous one, but because even when they arrive, they're then prosecuted for smuggling or in some cases, and you talk about one of these accounts in the book, for human trafficking. I wonder if you could reflect upon kind of what you've noticed in terms of how the state's not only kind of making it difficult to recognize these people as refugees, but also is using tools like prosecutions against the people that you met.
Yes, there are close to 2,000 people in prison now in Greece for accused of being human traffickers or smugglers because they steered their own little rubber dinghies, forgetting that what happens when you leave Turkey is the smuggler abandons you, and if somebody doesn't steer the boat, you'll all drown. So the criminalizing of doing that, the exaggeration of that is one big problem. But another one is in the language. Even the language becomes criminalizing because now the Greek government is insisting on calling asylum seekers illegal migrants. And I'm seeing this language in the UK as well. And it's highly inaccurate because it's not illegal to seek asylum. It's illegal. It's legal. It's a human right. And even if you break laws coming into the country, you're allowed to do that under the Geneva Convention on Refugee Rights because you're seeking asylum. So also, of course, that phrase, illegal migrant, suggests that everybody's coming just to make money or find a better life, and that they're not actually refugees from a deathly situation. And so it denies the reality and it denies their rights, and it leads directly to criminalizing them.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think you're right to make the analogy or the comparison with what's happening in the United Kingdom, because we certainly are not only not immune to that shift in the language by our government, but we've seen adoption of similar kinds of policies seeking to criminalize lifeboats that might rescue people stuck in the channel, floundering, and so on. But definitely the shift in language is an important part about how they try and kind of move the debate kind of to focus on something else.
Well, to arrest people for trying to save people from drowning, I mean, what kind of world is that, where you make it a criminal act to save somebody from death? That's so deeply against our values, almost everybody's values all over the world. And we are really in a kind of through the looking glass world here. It's actually, it matters a lot to pay attention to these things and the language too, because the language is what starts to eat away our reason and our rationality about such matters.
Absolutely. I mean, also, while we're on the topic of UK policy, you will both probably have noticed, albeit from afar, that the UK has been in the headlines recently about its response to refugees. And, you know, it strikes me that your book is particularly timely for us on this island, with the government similarly, you know, presenting giant fears of people who are taking similarly desperate journeys here. And you will have heard of the government's proposals to take new arrivals from here to Rwanda, to faraway places where they can be dumped, in effect, as well as to intern them while they're here in actually a place close to York that was met with a bit of local outrage in a disused military base just in the outskirts, well, a little bit beyond the outskirts of York. So there's a bit of a local York connection. I mean, looking at what you saw happening in Greece and what you've seen now happening in the UK, I mean, I'm just wondering what your reflections are, what lessons we should learn from the Greek example, because it seems in some ways our response is even worse than the Greek government's response that you described.
Well, it's very similar because the Greek government is locking people up in the remote prison-like camps now too. Actually, you know what, the Rwanda idea has a very sinister history. because the Nazis came up with a similar idea of what to do with Jews. It was called the Madagascar solution. They were going to send them to Madagascar, round up all the Jews in Europe, send them to Madagascar, put the SS in control, and run the entire island as a concentration camp, making life so miserable that in the hope that all the Jews would die. This didn't happen because the British Navy blockaded the way, and so the Germans gave up, luckily. But when you think of a history like that, it's a very sinister echo. And the idea of instead of going against our own promises after World War II to make sure that we would never do to refugees what we did to Jewish refugees and turn them away and send them back to our deaths, and creating the Geneva Convention for Human Rights. We're going against all those values, and we're breaking all the laws that that Europe is admired for. I mean, people come to Europe because they think they're going to be respected and find human rights and find freedom. And in the book, people say this over and over again. I've never seen anything like, even people who came from very poor villages, I've never seen any living conditions anything like as bad as on this island in Greece. And I have never been treated this badly, until the war. Yeah, do you want to add anything?
Do you think that this will help or stop the refugees from coming? As we mentioned before in the beginning, no one leaves his home country for fun. So this is not enough, and the people will stay coming if they are searching for safety and for dignity.
Yeah.
So I guess the government should act in a humane way, like treat the people and make it easy on them to come legally, instead of like pushing them back and treat them like criminals, because you are not punishing anyone except the one who take risk to just survive.
Yeah, I think the point you're making is if somebody had a choice, they wouldn't be getting on those boats, right? I mean, nobody who has a choice, who has a legal option, gets on a dinghy in the middle of an overcrowded dinghy in the middle of the night without knowing how to swim, that is steered by somebody who's never driven a boat before, somebody else in a similar situation, and is just basically told that they're going over there, wherever there happens to be when they left the land. No, you're absolutely right, I think, about that.
I don't know how to swim, so I took the boat because I had to.
Yeah,
no, absolutely. One of the questions in the question and answer that's being asked asks asks about the journey of becoming a refugee, I guess. And as you say, you present the lives of these different people, more than 5, but the kind of 5 principal stories in the book. And part of it is about their journey ultimately to Samos and elsewhere in Greece. And the question is, when you listen to those stories, and equally, Eyad, when you reflect upon your own experience, I mean, what was the hardest thing about leaving home?
Being forced to leave.
Yeah.
Because you are leaving everything behind you. Your friends, your memories, your future, because we had future there.
Yeah.
So this is the hardest thing.
Yeah.
Being
not having a choice.
yeah.
Yes.
Everybody in the book, each person, it tells why they left, the exact circumstances, and different ones. Some were war, the Taliban in one case, there's Assad's brutal oppression, and Syrians in another case. The Nigerian young man left because he is gay, and that's homosexuality is illegal in Nigeria, and he would have been killed if he'd stayed. He had to flee for his life, but he had a very stable upbringing with a loving family, and and friends and a career, and as a dancer, he was doing very well. He had to lose all of that. Another one, the one from Cameroon, Calvin, he was a political refugee, and he was imprisoned and tortured for opposing the dictator there, President Biya, and he was on the Cameroon's terrorist list. Just for all he did was demonstrate in the streets. He just was a protester, but he got caught, so he had to flee, or he would have been killed. They were wanted posters for him, but they all had that same feeling that he had just described. I mean, there was a great deal of love for home. Our parents left behind, siblings left behind, nieces and nephews, it's heartbreaking. Cousins.
And it strikes me that although it is you kind of describe it as not a choice, as though it's a moment when you don't have a choice. One of the tragedies of it is that it's a continuing reality. Because Helen, you mentioned kind of the family members that left behind, and some of the most poignant passages in the book describe moments when somebody has already left, has already been forced to leave, where they wish they could go back because a family member is in crisis, somebody needs to be buried. The promises that they've made to honor people and to fulfill obligations, and people are unable to go back. It's not having a choice on an ongoing basis to not just making you leave, but not allowing you to go back.
Right. But that's one of the reasons we don't give people's last names too, by the way. It's not only to protect their own asylum cases, but chances, but their family at home, in some cases, their family at home could be in danger if we gave their names.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Your book, you describe, and you've mentioned this already, as being part of a process of conversations. And that process continued in person, online, in person, again, as the circumstance allowed. And I mean, it more than kind of any other book that I've read, it really is kind of the moment. I mean, it's fresh off the presses. I mean, it's just finished literally months ago. It strikes me that just as you finished the book, and maybe my chronology is slightly off here, but just as you were doing the final corrections, we had emerged in this part of the world, what has now become kind of one of the world's biggest refugee crises, the Ukrainian outflow. And suddenly, the Syrian crisis that had occupied the headlines a decade ago, the Afghan crisis of last summer, has now been kind of swamped in the media discussion, the popular discussion, the political discussion, by conversations about what we can do to respond to the Ukrainians. And it also, I suppose, doesn't take somebody looking very hard at the situation to realize that how Europe at least has responded to the Ukrainians is hugely different than how they responded to the Syrians and certainly the Afghans, any of the individuals the situations that you described.
Yeah.
What are your reflections on that? I mean, on kind of what we can draw from this book about both how we should be responding to the Ukrainians, but also how we should, what can we do from our response to Ukrainians that might help the people that you talk about in this book as well?
Well, the way we've been responding to the Ukrainians is the way we should be responding to all refugees. The kind of willingness to help, the speeding up of paperwork, the instant temporary protected status for 3 years that Europe has offered, the EU has offered, the right to work and go to school, helping people find houses, opening your house to them. All these things could be done for everyone. And it's wonderful that it's been done for the Ukrainians. But why hasn't it been done for Afghans and Syrians and others? I think we know the answer. And I'm going to say it because I think we have to say it. It's a deep, deep racism and a deep, deep Islamophobia in some cases, although of course lots of Christian refugees are out there too, as well as other religions. And it's a deep threat of seeing people as the other because they don't look like you. which we really, the human beings by now should have gotten over, if you ask me, given how mixed up the world is and how open culture is. So the hope is we've proven that we can actually do really well by refugees. The sad thing is we're persecuting one lot of refugees at the same time as helping the other. How do we justify that?
What are your thoughts, Eyad?
I would say it is really great that they have been doing something for the Ukrainian refugees because they deserve being treated well. Everyone who has war or who fled his country for reasons. So, but the sad thing, like the difference between the treatment, as Helen mentioned before, like, yeah, it is sad for me when I see that what I am forbid, when what is allowed to the Ukrainian refugees is not allowed to me. When you are like, let's say that a lot of European countries, they have given them the permission to work. And this is not something easy for us to get. You have to go through long procedures, boring procedures. So I wish that the world act as the way they act towards the Ukrainian refugees. And don't forget that we have also the same common thing, the ocean as well.
Yeah, so, common enemy.
Exactly.
No, absolutely. One of the questions in the Q&A goes back to something, Eyad, you talked about right when you first met Helen, in terms of needing to meet her in the forest, in which you slept initially because you weren't allowed to meet, or it was frowned upon to be talking to journalists inside the camp. And so one of the questions asks about kind of restrictions upon media reporting, and what your thoughts are about kind of, I mean, how difficult it is to get the stories out, and yeah, the issues arising from that.
Sorry, what exactly you mean? Like why there wasn't enough reporting of the situation in the camp?
Yeah, I guess the question, the extent to which you think it's possible for journalists to talk to refugees, whether it's how easy it is to report on the conditions in the camps, for example.
I think the right person to answer this question is Helen, because she is a journalist, and she tried to see the camp manager after. Who
canceled on me. Actually, it's not just frowned on. She was calling the police on journalists and getting them arrested if they sneaked into the camp or got caught taking pictures. Not all camp managers are so tight. This was her, but of course they immediately raised the question of what's she trying to hide. This is a Greek government-run, camp with the help of the UN, by the way. But the thing is, that camp and the other island camps at the time and for years were open, which meant that people did have the right, as Eyad mentioned, to leave and go into the towns. It was very easy to meet asylum seekers because you could just accost them and offer them coffee like I did with Eyad. Now, though, they're being herded more and more into these closed prison-like camps with incredible surveillance cameras and drones and electric bracelets, and that makes it much harder for journalists to get any kind of access. Or they're being put in really remote camps, as I mentioned before, even more remote than the island camps that the press doesn't even really know about or pay attention to. So there's this hiding away and barricading, imprisoning refugees who are not criminals and have never been tried of crime and yet have been turned into prisoners is harder, is much harder. But really, there are people who've gone through this experience all around. And if you're an enterprising journalist, you can find them. Just go to port cities all over Europe, go to the refugee encampments. You can find people.
Although I suppose the other part of the equation is the distribution of those kind of stories and the challenges of getting those kind of stories heard in more of the mainstream media outlets.
Exactly. And then also there's the kind of agreement you might have to make with with the government or the camp manager to get in, so maybe you can only show a good side of the camp. Or maybe you can have one little slightly bad story, but that you've got to quickly balance it with, oh yes, we're perfectly happy here kind of thing. I have seen some reporting like that, which is very disturbing. So it's not good fact checking.
Yeah. One of our guests in the chat has commented on something that we've also spoken about, which is the closing chapter of the book, which I think quite importantly tries to set out what can be done. Because I think many times we get to the end of accounts like this, and there's in a sense a real desire to act, but sometimes a paralysis in terms of not knowing exactly what to do. And I think your book kind of eschews easy kind of solutions because recognizing it's a complicated problem. But I wondered if both of you could kind of speak to that, particularly in the context of, an audience now largely, I think, living here in the UK in a place like York, where these issues are in the headlines, where, our government is also fragile, for better and for worse, probably in terms of policy advocacy, but where there's also kind of a growing appetite maybe to try and change some of this. What can be done? What needs to be done? What can we do?
Well, maybe I'll start. There's the larger level, like what you can do politically, who you vote for, very important. If you really care about, helping people who need help and about extending human rights, think about the policies and the values of the people you vote for, and you might put that up there at the top of the list. You can donate, you can volunteer, you can protest, you can sign petitions, you can, but there are individual ways you can help as well. There are several organizations we list in the back of the book that you can join to host a refugee family in your home, or just have them to tea or have them to dinner. Mursal talks very movingly about just how much kindness, I mentioned this before, she would say, just somebody's warm voice on the telephone, she would say, this is everything to us. So being kind to people, being welcoming, that can make a big difference too, or finding small ways to help. You don't have to have a lot of money to help somebody find their way, or put them onto an organization, or ask your friends if they know a lawyer who could help them for free, that kind of help, for example. Can you think of some others, Eyad? We do have a whole chapter about this. But
We have a whole chapter. If you cannot do anything of what we mentioned, I think just being kind and keeping like a smiley face towards the people who are different than you, I think this is more than enough.
Yeah.
Personally, I'm talking about myself. I would say this is enough for me, because that will make me feel that I am human like him or like her.
Yeah, no, I think those are really wonderful observations, and yeah, it's kind of probably a fitting way to end our conversation this evening. Thank you so very much. Not just for joining us here this evening and sharing with us your thoughts, your responses to our questions, but also for bringing into this world what I think is a really important book. Bringing us your story, Eyad, but the stories of the other people you told in the book, which I think are really important. Are, as you say, as you described, kind of are crying out to be heard, and which are wonderfully told. Told by them and presented so well by you. I should say, for those who haven't been able to get a hold of a copy of Helen and Eyad's book, Map of Hope and Sorrow, Stories of Refugees Trapped in Greece, it is available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And for more information on book sales, you can see the festival website, or you can take a look at the Fox Lane Books website, which should be a link to which should be appearing in the chat box. beyond that, as I said at the start, this week also marks Refugee Week here in the United Kingdom, but also around the world. And as we move towards World Refugee Day, there's a range of events happening locally in York. So I would encourage you all to take a look at some of those. There are restaurants, pop-up restaurants opening up, bringing you Syrian and Afghan food. There's theatrical performances. There's opportunities to meet with and talk to people to show the kind of solidarity that Eyad and Helen spoke about. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at that website on the Refugee Action York website, and to partake of those wonderful opportunities to begin to be part of the solution to this horrible problem that we've allowed to happen, and we've inflicted upon too many people so far. As I said at the start, so thank you. I mean, both Eyad, Helen, and very much for joining us. As I said at the start, we're going to close the event now with the video of an inspirational story from a PhD student at the politics department at the University of York, Mamoon Kawar. And so we'll say goodbye and then leave you with that video. So thank you and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello and assalamu alaikum. My name is Mamoon Kawar and I'm from Afghanistan. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Department of Politics, University of York. I would like to take this brief opportunity to share with you my 12 years of journey with the University of York. I would like to share with you why I am in York and what York means to me. I started working with the University of York in 2010 when it had an evaluation project with Afghanistan's National Solidarity Program, NSP, the country's flagship community-based development program. From NSP's side, I was the project coordinator. Being one of the world's prestigious institutions, I was immensely inspired and always wished to study here. I started my first master's degree in Public Administration, International Development with the Department of Social Policy and Social Work through an online program. In 2014, I was granted UK's prestigious Chevening Scholarship, and I had the honor to pursue my second MA degree in International Relations at York's Department of Politics. But that was not enough, because I wanted to carry on and do a PhD program as well. After returning to Afghanistan in 2015 and spending several years of working with various national and international organizations in Kabul, in 2021, I had an honor to receive an unconditional offer of a PhD. With all those emotions and excitements of returning to York in my heart and mind, my PhD journey from Afghanistan to York was not easy. It was 15 August 2021 when Kabul was captured by the Taliban. Like many other Afghans, I was stuck there with my family and had no way to get out of the country. Whilst it was a complete chaos, international flights were suspended, airports were closed, and people had no access to banks and money, I was hopeless, helpless, and distressed. I had no hope to be able to make it to the UK. But it was not the case. In the middle of that dark tunnel of hopelessness, there was a bright candle of hope. One evening, I was contacted by the university. They asked me to stay strong and hopeful. They offered me assistance, guidance, and information about how to safely leave Afghanistan. More importantly, given my circumstances, I was granted an equal access scholarship to pursue my PhD and start a new life in the UK with my family. As such, York is not just a university to me, it's beyond an academic institution. As a university for public good and on the principles of excellence and opportunity for all, the University of York is a university of sanctuary. York is not just a university to me because it took my hand and embraced me in times of difficulty. York is not just a university to me because it provided me sanctuary. As I very much enjoy my research project now, without York's courageous support and generous gifts of our donors, my PhD journey to the UK wouldn't have been possible. Thank you.